What's up, Roadside History fans? Today I've got a great story for you. I'm actually traveling on a short road trip with my beautiful daughter, Sadie. Everybody say hi to Sadie. She doesn't want to be on camera. Sadie and I are on a short little drive up through the mountains to tell you a story, an amazing story, about one of America's most decorated early pilots in American history. It's a story of a man by the name of Maurice Maury Graham. He became a decorated pilot during World War I, and after World War I had several ventures, including flying mail from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City. He would disappear one night on a stormy, cold January night. His disappearance had over 691 pounds of mail with him and over $1 million in securities. Some people wondered if he took off, fled the country, maybe went to Mexico. Other people wondered if he had been the first victim of an airplane heist. And yet there were other people who even wondered if the Paiute Indians maybe had something to do with his disappearance. I'm going to tell you more about the story. I'm going to take you to a historical marker that gives you a little bit of information about it. But I'm going to tell you more about Maury Graham and the significance that he had and his story on this episode of Roadside History. So stay tuned, and if you haven't liked and subscribed to my channel, please do so. To give you a little bit of background on Maurice Graham, this is a man who had flown an airplane at this point for a lot of years. Graham was known as a world champion mail pilot. This man had traveled routes from all over the United States, but most importantly from LA to Salt Lake City, which is where he normally would deliver his mail to. When he disappeared on January of 1930, his company was so worried about him that they offered a $5,000 reward, which may not seem like a lot of money in today's day, but keep in mind, this was January 1930. In 1929, in November of 1929, one of the worst episodes in American economic history, happened. It was the crash of the stock market in the beginning of the Great Depression. So for a company to offer a reward in the amount of $5,000 to locate him represents a significant amount of money at the time. This $5,000 reward that would be offered for locating Graham by Western Air Express, the company that he worked for, like I mentioned, was a significant amount of money, and it represented the seriousness of his disappearance and what he had with him, which obviously leads to the speculation as to where he may have gone and why he may have gone there. But what's interesting is in 1928, this man was dubbed by the Professional Pilots Association to be the champion of airmail pilots. I mean, this is a man who they had complete confidence in, a man who had flown over 213,000 miles, over 2,200 hours in the air, and he did this in an open-air cockpit plane. He flew a red Boeing 95 aircraft. It's an open cockpit aircraft. It didn't fly at 38,000 feet like airliners do today. That wasn't possible. So he stayed low to the ground. And on that January afternoon, when he set out from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City, he knew there was a storm coming. He would stop or plan to stop in Cedar City to refuel. But when he got to Cedar City, Utah, along the I-15 corridor, he couldn't stop to refuel. And so he decided to take a different approach. Maury Graham would be literally thrown into the fire. In early 1918, he joined the 50th Squadron, and he flew DH-4s. DH-4 aircraft are really nose-heavy aircraft. They're not real versatile. Even in their time, they weren't real versatile. But Graham would fly these airplanes, and I mentioned that he would kind of be thrown to the fire. He would fly on several missions. He was an incredible pilot. He'd become a captain and become an incredible pilot that would become well decorated, not just in the United States, but the world over. He was very well represented and very well respected. After only a few weeks on the job, the 50th Aero Squadron was tasked with finding the 77th Battalion in Germany. And these individuals that were part of the 77th Battalion would become known as the Lost Battalion. It was 550 men that would be cut off in the Ardennes Forest, the thick, heavy canopy Ardennes Forest, by German forces. In October of that year, he would fly through heavy fog, he would fly through gunfire, he would risk everything to find these men, and ultimately he would. These DH-4s that Graham would fly would become known as flying coffins. Literally, they weren't fast, they were nose heavy, and they managed to absorb a lot of bullets from German ground fire. But in part of this rescue, Captain Graham would be awarded the Distinguished Flying Award, the Distinguished Flying Cross. Not only would he rescue these men, but he would go on to shoot down surveillance balloons and weather balloons and other items that the Germans had out during World War I. And after his return home, he would take on a lot of opportunities. In fact, well, actually before he went home, he stayed in Europe and flew around Europe for a while, and even became a pilot of sorts, taking people out on joyrides, letting them experience what it would be like to be in an airplane. He would become a great pilot, and that leads me to where I am today. Today I'm actually standing at a memorial that's on top of a mountaintop. We're about 9,000 feet in elevation, and you can see the flag behind me. And yes, there is a light right off to the side on the post here to keep that flag lit at night, for those of you who are curious. But there's also a memorial here to Captain Graham that you can see. And this is a great memorial that was dedicated by the Sons of the Utah Pioneers, the Cedar City, Utah chapter. I'm not far from Cedar City now, and I want to tell you a little bit about this. What you're looking at, I'm going to turn the camera around a little bit here, but what you're looking at behind me here is Canara Mountain. Canara Mountain is a pretty high, rugged area. It's way off the beaten path, and to this direction a little bit more is an area known as Cedar City, Utah. The area this way is St. George, Utah, and we're up above Kolob Reservoir. And in the background behind me here, you can see that there's some beautiful mountains off in the distance, and that's Highway 14 that'll take you over Cedar Mountain and down into Highway 89, which takes you over to Bryce Canyon. It's a really beautiful area. It's incredibly remote, and we are way up in elevation. So how do we get to this point? Why do we have this memorial? Where does all this come from? Let me tell you a little bit about that. I mentioned earlier that Maury Graham flew mail, and he ran a regular route from Los Angeles, California, all the way up to Salt Lake City. And he would do this day after day, delivering the mail, and he logged hundreds and thousands of miles as a pilot. One of the things that's interesting about Graham is when he took off that January 10th day in 1930, he knew there was a storm. And in those days, pilots flew fairly low so that they could see lights to help guide them where they needed to go. But he knew there was an approaching storm. It wasn't something that was new to him. Captain Graham had flown through storms many a times. In fact, in one of his most heroic efforts, when he found this lost battalion, he flew through heavy fog to find these men. Not only heavy fog, but gunfire, as I mentioned earlier. Well, as the story goes, Graham would take off, and he would come, and he would try to land in Cedar City. And there were all sorts of lights set up to help guide him in. But the snow was so heavy that night that he wasn't able to make this stop. We know he stopped in Las Vegas to refuel, and then he took off again, and Cedar City is about 3 hours north of Las Vegas, but he wasn't able to land. In fact, he was last spotted flying, I believe it was northwest of Cedar City. He wouldn't be seen again, and people would wonder what happened. As I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of rumors. Did he get airline heisted, or did somebody rob his airplane? Was he captured by Indians? There were so many stories. Did he go off course and fly to Mexico and fly away with the mail that he had? Immediately, when he didn't arrive at his destination, search crews set out. The United States government set out search crews. The residents in Cedar City, Utah sent out search and rescue crews. The United States Postal Service even got involved. All of these individuals got involved and sought out looking for his plane. Well, as you can imagine, in a heavy snowstorm in January, they didn't have much luck finding him. Ultimately, his fate will be sealed several months later in the early summer when his body will be found. But there's more to the story. You can imagine in a harrowing snowstorm, it would have been very difficult. Maury Graham is able to land his aircraft. He'll crash land it, but nevertheless, he'll land it. And when rescuers finally catch up to where the airplane is, there's fuel still in the wings. The fuselage is still intact, but there's no Maury Graham. There's a note that had been left, and I'm going to just let you see it here, what it says. Right here, Maury Graham's log entry says, January 11th, 1930, arrived 2:30 a.m., no destination. No destination. So where did he go? That would become the next thing, and people would set out trying to find Graham. Graham would leave. His mail carriage would be intact. I mentioned that the mail and the securities that were with them were all still very much intact. And he would set out on foot in the middle of a harrowing snowstorm at about 9,500 feet in elevation. You can imagine the wind, the cold, the depth of the snow. It would have been incredible. He'll set out, and he's not going to make it far because, as I mentioned earlier, some residents from Parowan, Utah, in July of that year are going to find his body. They're going to find his body down in a canyon area, a little hollow, and when they find his body, he has some of the mail vest and mail carrier stuff on him, still sealed, that he was trying to get to a destination. Perhaps that mail carrier vest with some of the mail helped to keep him warm. I don't know. But at the end, Maury Graham will be deceased, and his body will be found 7 months later. You can imagine his wife was devastated. You know, it's an interesting story. His wife, he actually proposed to his wife just a few weeks after coming home from World War I. And they had a great relationship and even had children. In fact, she kissed him goodbye the day that he left. I really hope you liked learning a little bit about Captain Maurice Graham. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the story of him, who he was, his decorated pilot, and ultimately his fate. If you enjoyed this story and you like other stories similar to it, please like and subscribe to my channel, Roadside History, and share this story with others. Till next time, have a safe road trip.